Good evening. Welcome to a Zoom talk and Q&A with Dr. Katelyn Bouska, an American pianist of Czech ancestry, which is streamed live from Philadelphia. My name is Miroslav Konvalina. I am the director of Czech Center, New York, and it's a pleasure to welcome you tonight. We would like to bring together American and Czech classical music. We want to explore the common inspiration as well as American interpretations of the music by the Czech composer Bohuslav Martinů. It's because on March the 31st, we marked 80 years since his arrival in New York. He spent some of the most inspiring years of his career in the USA, mostly in New York and around the East Coast. Katelyn Bouska is a frequent solo and collaborative musician. She is known for her unique programming, which combines rarely heard Czech and American music with pieces which were written specifically for her by rising composers. She has found an audience throughout America as well as on the international concert stage. Katelyn received a DMA from Temple University in Philadelphia, where her research centered on the piano music of 20th century Brno, the Moravian and Czech composer Miloslav Istvan. In addition to her doctorate, she also holds graduate degrees in historical keyboard performance and collaborative piano. Katelyn is currently based in Philadelphia, where she serves on the music studies faculty of the Curtis Institute of Music. Her commitment to informed and personal musical expression extends beyond her piano studio. She holds seminars on performance practice, continuo and period repertoire, and she offers classes which explore theory and harmony as a tool to unlock the grammar of music. After Katelyn's talk, there will be time for Q&A, and you are welcome to stay, enjoy the discussion if you are on Zoom in our chat. So let's enjoy Martinů music together and welcome Katelyn Bouska.
Thank you, Mirek, very much for your introduction and for inviting me back to another collaboration. I remember so fondly the one that we did back in April last year, Leos Janacek, which was a wonderful experience for me. And now back to be talking about Bohuslav Martinů. Welcome to everyone who's in the list here. I see many familiar faces and some that I haven't yet had the pleasure to meet. So I do hope that sometime in the future or in our discussion after the event that we can share some ideas, and if you have some questions, I can attempt to answer them as well. The central figure for the evening, though I'll be drawing in a few others, is that of Bohuslav Martinů, who is a fascinating and excitingly complex figure, not only for his vast experience and vast output. He was writing more than 400 compositions, which is a staggering number, considering that he had also such a nomadic life, living in many different countries, being displaced through war and other political regime changes. Also, he's very an interesting man for not having what we commonly talk of as a photographic memory, but a phonographic memory, meaning that he could hear anything, even up to an hour-long symphony, and after go home, listen through, analyze, and write out the entire thing, which was an incredible feat and was a gift and also caused him some troubles in his life that we will explore a little bit. Because of his unique period in time, he led a very different life and enjoyed a very different reputation than the other of the sort of big four composers that we talk about or think about in Czech music. The first, of course, being Smetana, then Dvořák, Janacek, and finally Martinů. They were all all born in the 19th century. Bohuslav Martinů was born at the end, but because of being displaced in World War II and then being sort of banned from his country during the years of the communist regime that he was living, he had to find a much different trajectory and source for his music than Smetana, Dvorak, and Janacek, who were still living and working in their country of origin. Now, I want to give a word of caution to you and your thinking, and even to myself, because Martinů wrote later in his life that he felt there was two big tragedies or obstacles when it comes to music education or attempting to think about music, approaching music. The first, he said, was the danger of over-romanticizing a composer and their inspiration, which I laugh at because as a performer, I'm always looking for this inspiration and personal connection with the performer or the composer. So there's times, you like to imagine that the composer is walking in a star-lit field and he sees a starry falling star and he gets inspired and he writes a piece, and then you try to recreate it at the piano. So Martinů was very against anything but respect for the composer and the hard work that he did. On the other side, he felt that music really suffered because of overanalyzing and dissecting that musical scholars and musical scientists did. So as a musicologist myself, I have to be careful of these two poles of thought, right? The over-romanticizing of the performer and then the over-analyzing of the scholar. So we'll try to leave those aside. And instead, what I wanted to share with you is actually to pose two questions for you that are questions that I have had for the last 10 years or more that I've been thinking about Martinů, and that guided me through selecting some of these pieces. So I would like to share the two questions with you and then kind of walk through some of the answers or thoughts that I have. And then hopefully in the discussion at the end, we can find if you have some disagreements or some other thoughts. The first one has to do with the fact that if you read through Martinú's bio, a quick overlook, he was involved in some of the most central artistic colonies in Paris and in New York at kind of their highest peak. And he was very influential, active, as I said, wrote more than 400 compositions. He was teaching at some of the most important faculties in the US in the 1940s and 50s. But however, he left no school of composition, no significant students, and nobody to really pull his legacy into the present day. This was really highlighted into me when I was reading sort of what this sort of expat community he would have moved to in New York in 1941, escaping Paris. And he shared a flat just a few blocks away from Bela Bartok, who was a Hungarian composer and also seeking refuge from the war. And it was interesting that Martinů wrote that he felt compassionate for Bartók because none of his compositions were being performed and he was afraid of dying in obscurity. On the flip side, Martinů was getting widely performed and he had some of his most successful years in the 40s and the early 50s. And it looked like he was poised to be the leading figure of the rest of the 20th century. But now, on the opposite, we've forgotten about Martinů for many unfortunate reasons, and Bartók has sort of transcended into one of the leading figures that we emulate or follow. And I want to pose the question of why that happened and what we can do to remedy it going forward. The other question is a little bit more personal. That one was more philosophical or historical question. But the personal question is, how can we relate to his works? He's been criticized as having an uneven output, which I disagree with. I think his compositions are incredibly well crafted and well thought out, but they do vary wildly in style. The three pieces that I chose to play for you this evening demonstrate how differently each one sound, and you might be hard pressed at first hearing to be able to tell that they were written by the same composer. And I have some theories about why these have such a different sort of change in mind. But we have to ask ourselves, is it important or even desirable for a composer to sound like himself or herself, whatever that means, their entire life? Or is it a symbol of a very unique mind that they can adopt and write in so many different styles and still have a high quality of writing? So those are the two questions for you. And I do want to jump in and give you just a little slideshow with a few dates and organization for the evening. But first, let's hear a little bit of music to have resonance in your mind of Bohuslav Martinů. So the piece that I'm going to play is a piece that he still wrote in his Czech years when he was largely self-taught, and it's based off a Czech folk song. And it has a very, very simple melody, but a pulsing rhythm that is very characteristic that you'll hear throughout the evening as we approach other pieces by Martinů and ones that are inspired by him. And it's from a collection called Lotky, or Puppets, and the title is Columbine is Singing. So to give you a little bit of structure for the evening, and also to introduce you to some major points of his life if you're unfamiliar, there's a picture of him in a very pensive, possibly compositional mode. So his early years in his 20s is when he composed the piece that I just played. And what is fascinating to me about Martinů and the amount of creativity that he was able to put into his compositions is he was almost completely self-taught as a composer, which speaks to both of his talent, his hard work ethic, and also sort of his drive to connect with the self-expression of the unique type of mind that he had, which we'll dive into for a second. He did study briefly at the Prague Conservatory, but at that time they had no composition department. So he was studying violin, which he hated the exercises, so he would skip his lessons. I hope none of my students are listening because I cannot condone such behavior, but he would skip his lessons and instead go to the theater and go to the opera and go to the symphony, listen to the music, write it down, and teach himself how to compose from the music that he was learning. Eventually, he was kicked out of the Prague Conservatory. His teacher famously wrote that if he could give Martinů a grade lower than 0, he would, but it didn't exist. So that's a wonderful, maybe little scar on his life that he shrugged off, and he went back to his hometown of Polička and decided what he could do. He realized that if he wanted to sort of push against some of the more traditional aspects of what was happening in the Prague Conservatory, he had to leave the country. He was inspired by Debussy and French Impressionism, so he moved to Paris. And this French aspect of the Impressionism you'll hear quite a bit in the next piece I'll play, which is a tango from his early years in Paris. But first, one interesting sort of clue or interesting thought that came up throughout my research and conversations with people who had either, maybe their parents had known Martinů firsthand or had written about primary accounts of his life, was coming back to this unique way of thinking and unique connection to the world. And it's very important to realize perhaps why he was not so successful as a teacher, but also, more importantly, it helps us know how to listen and approach his music, because as a composer and a musician, he was not following the normal route of connecting to an audience that the composers before him, definitely Dvorak and Smetana, were doing. Instead, he had a kind of a separation from the creative process, mainly because he was composing in his mind. So we need to find a way to maybe experience the music in a different way. One theory that has been propounded to me personally was his early lifestyle in Polička. So I remember the first time I visited this small town. It's very picturesque and it still has the medieval sort of castle walls. I was with a colleague of mine who is a wonderful musician, and he showed me the church tower that Martinů had spent his early years, all 283 steps. His family had an apartment at the top. And as a child, he was too ill to do the steps himself. So he lived in the tower and he watched the people 283 steps down in the square. And he wrote about a sense of detachment, watching them not as real people going about their daily concerns, but sort of figures in an opera or in a theater. And it definitely inspired him to be a very important dramatic composer. But we kind of have this psychological distancing, which I think is the key to connecting to especially his later works, which we'll listen to in a bit. Moving on to his Paris time, this was such an exciting time. If I could go back to one period in history, going to those interwar years, the 20s in Paris would be amazing. If you think of the music, the art, the new art forms, and theater, dance that was all exploding in this small vicinity, it must have been an amazing time. And immediately you hear Martinů reflecting his environment. So of all of his works, the ones that are less connected to the Czech or the mature times are these first couple that he was playing in Paris. When you listen to the tango, I want you to focus on two things. The tango is obviously a Latin American dance, but it was sort of a craze period in the 1920s. Everyone in Paris was either dancing to it or finding some sort of artistic interpretation in their art form, if it would be writing, painting, or music. I really love this version because you can hear that Martinů is really attempting to learn what he can from the Debussy style. So he begins very strict tango rhythm, and then there's a hint of jazz with a little grace note. And then in the middle section, he slows the tempo down, puts the pedal on to haze everything out, and then we have just an impression of a tango under tempo someplace in the distance before it comes sort of rattling back into your face. The bulk of what I think is his most musical and most interesting development is what happened right before he left the country and moved to New York. So I'm trying to give you this basic of his self-taught sort of Czech connection to folk tunes and Czech rhythms, and also his early absorption of these sort of modern elements. before we jump into this period of maturation, 1939, 1940, and then finish with some of his more mature movements. But let me play for you now this tango, written when he was just 9 months first into the country. So you can imagine some of the more conservative music teachers back in Prague hearing some of these first Parisian outbursts from the young Martinů, and they were very shocked, and they basically said that he was sort of selling out his Czech culture, and unfortunately those people stayed in power and for a long time were not interested in Martinů. For the rest of his life, even in the last month of his life, when he was suffering from cancer and had an operation, he was still writing letters to the Prague Conservatory and to other institutions asking for a place, asking to be able to come back home. It's indicative that even though he spent more than a third of his life abroad without being able to return even to visit his country, he never set roots into any one place, and wherever he was writing letters, he always referred to the then Czechoslovakia as home, and wherever he was as the wandering place. When he escaped from Paris to New York, he had 4 suitcases, and at the end of his life, when he left New York and to Switzerland, he still only had 3 suitcases of belonging. In his mind, he was looking to return home, and unfortunately that was not possible for him. So what he called his time of experimentation was writing a lot of pieces like I just played. Of course, that was a miniature. He wrote many longer pieces, but they were basically responding to the environment, to the popular environment of what he was hearing in Paris in the 1930s and the late 1920s. So a lot of jazz, a lot of popular music, a lot of elements of Stravinsky and rhythm, and a little bit of connection with the Surrealism movement and Dada as well. In about 1937 and 1938, he started to become more serious, and there was 2 factors. One, he realized that his period of experimentation was over, and he was really ready to debark onto what would be, he considered, his mature and serious style. The other was an important relationship with a young student, Vítězslava Kaprálová, who was also a composer and someone that Martinů had known as a young girl, but in her early 20s, she came to Paris, first a student of his and then later a collaborator. It's interesting that throughout his life, Martinů was always searching for someone who was more extroverted, who knew how to connect to audiences. And Kaprálová was a perfect connection for him. She was a conductor, very vivacious and outgoing, and she knew exactly in her compositions how to cross the divide from music to the audience. And Martinů was more rather expecting the audience to come to him, which is what we are doing today and what I have been doing and try to approach to his music. But to illustrate this, at the end of the evening, I've paired one of my favorite works of Martinů with one of my favorite works by Kaprálová, just to show, even though they're using the exact same rhythm and similar idioms, that with Martinů, there's that extra bit of effort and imagination that we as a performer or as an audience needs to do. And in my mind, that might be the single most reason why he's sort of fallen to the side without having a champion to interpret his works to the world and also to connect the living tradition of when he was alive to what is currently happening in the music making. A very tragic event, as anyone who is living in 1939, 1940 would have some tragic story as they're watching more and more of Europe being sort of engulfed by the Nazi onslaught. Martinů was very lucky to have a support system to extract him from Paris. He left 4 days before the Nazis invaded the country, and the very next day, after they officially took Paris, they came knocking on his door to arrest him, as he had been blacklisted for his support of the Czech resistance at the time. When he was fleeing in June was also the day that Kaprálová died from tuberculosis. So imagine his distraught sort of feeling as he's taking 9 months to try to leave Paris, get on a ship, and come to New York, as a very close inspiration and muse had passed away so suddenly. He had to leave so quickly he wasn't able to bring any of his scores with him. But we in the US, and especially in New York, are able to benefit from that, because as soon as he arrived, what he had to do to make a place and also support himself was to begin to compose again from scratch. He had no scores with him. In the American years, as we call them, he wrote 6 symphonies, which are marvels of work, considering that he wrote them exclusively in his mind. You will also notice that he stopped writing these small miniature pieces. In my mind, what he was writing in Paris were more studies or sketches or etudes to understand his musical style and to also understand the people around him. Another habit that he made his entire life was to buy detective novels, because he wrote that if he could read the detective novels, read through the human character, and somehow catch the clues before the detective in the book did, he would somehow learn more about how to connect or how to understand the human nature around him. So it really does illustrate this unique mind who lives in his own world, but was desperately longing to connect and create what was happening in his own experience to the experience of the people around him. We are very lucky, those of us who are living or working on the East Coast, because for the period of early 1940s to early 50s, he was involved in some of the most important institutions. So he is involved in Mannes. He spent 1 year at my home institution at Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. He was at Princeton for some time, and also, it's now called Tanglewood, but it was the Berkshires Festival back then with Aaron Copland. And this is where the question came to me, because he worked with so many important students and many students who became well influential composers in their own right. But something about his teaching style didn't connect with the composition students. And my opinion is, it's very unlikely that he met a composition student who had the same mind and ability that he had for hearing and sort of phonating or audiating the scores in his head. So there's many comments of his students or colleagues who wrote with wonder about how he was able to recall these musical details, or how he was able to sit in silence or on his nightly walks and come back and just sit down and write out a score. But I imagine that for someone with a more neurotypical mind, that would be a difficult teacher and student relationship. One thing that I think is very important, and you will hear it in the sonata movement that I'll play in a few minutes, is his concept of taking a single motive and exploiting it to its fullest events. We haven't had an opportunity to hear that yet, because I was playing short miniature pieces that was representative of his early and experimental style. He famously told a composer student once who came to him at Tanglewood in his first year saying, "Oh, you have so many ideas, you have so many motives on this score, you have to save some, because when you're older, you won't be able to remember or make so many good motives. You have to learn how to take one or two and exploit it to its fullest." And that's what he does with the Piano Sonata. He finished it in 1954. So this is close to the end of his life, when he was beginning to suffer some of the ill effects of the cancer that would take his life in a few years. So the prolific nature of his composition was really over at this point. But in its stead, in its replacement, we get a profundity of texture and this beautiful architectural space. And this is what I want to challenge you, and this has challenged me upon the first hearing or the first reading through of the piece. It was difficult for me immediately to understand what was the shape or what Martinů was trying to say in this piece. It doesn't have necessarily a melody that we can follow, doesn't necessarily have a clear or overarching form to guide us through the climaxes and the catharsis moments. Instead, I think we have to change our listening and think as he was doing at the time, which was architecturally, thinking, this is the sound space I have. I want to have these thicker moments. I need some light vacant spots here, maybe some brighter texture or more rhythmic texture in the background. And if we can try to hear as he did the entire piece at once, then out of this 8-minute long piece, there begins to pop structural moments that you could imagine as a picture frame in front of you. Now, I know I'm asking a lot of you if you're hearing this movement for the first time, so go ahead and find a recording and listen to it later on your own time. But see if you can't sort of relax the expectations of time when we're listening to a piece and just let it move through you. It starts with a very dissonant and vibrant full texture, which it continues through a few minutes. And just when you least expect it, after a big crescendo, there's a pause and there's a moment of, in my ear, utter loneliness, where after you've been surrounded by so many sound waves, literally, if you're here on an acoustic instrument, and then a single note, and then a single scale in C minor, and then it comes back again. But these are the moments that are so special in his writing if we change our ears to listen in more of this architectural point instead of the common sort of sentence structure that we think of in classical music. Followed by that, I will play one short movement by Kaprálová, and I chose to pair them because the ending rhythm that Martinů uses is the same rhythm that Kaprálová starts her movement. And if you remember back to the first piece I played, it's the same rhythm that the left hand was playing this. So that's one common thread that might be hard to hear on first notice. And I won't run the danger of over dissecting, but it is a pretty obvious rhythmic gesture that he uses. And lastly, before I play, I do want to share a quote with you This was from late in Martinů life, and it's from an undated letter. Presumably, the contents in the rest of the letter dates it sometime in the mid-50s, 1950s. And it gives you an idea, and it definitely gave me or enlightened me when I was approaching some of the more difficult music or abstract music, was his idea of what is the relationship between your psychology. So he writes, artistic creation is the product of the composer's skill to guide the interaction between the subconscious. And I wrote repository of the artist's experiences. So subconscious, the way I was reading it, was what are the things that have built up in your experience of your life, in your training, etc., but you're not aware of it. And the conscious. So he's trying to see how they relate to each other, the part that you know and are aware of, and the part that is just the build-up of your life, of your story, of your history. And then Martinů says there is a concentration needed, so a very specific type of thinking to bind one's attention to the purely abstract primary impulse. And this is the key to understanding the more difficult music, is it's meant to be purely abstract. It's not meant to be like the folk music, eliciting a story or a specific movement, or in the tango, all the connections of what we know about the dance. Simply abstract musical sounds put in space to guide what our impulse is going to be. And then after that, after you've had that in your mind, then it's just making these small tweaks to make the music clear for yourself. So a few thoughts for you as I play the second movement of Martinú's Piano Sonata No. 1, but of course the only one that he wrote. And I will follow immediately after the Kaprálová Prelude No. 2, and then I would love to hear your thoughts, background, questions, comments, etc. So I was reminded before I open it for discussion, but I was smiling to myself when I finished the Martinů before I started the Kaprálová, because the whole time it's dissonant and there's really no clear tonal section or chord or note that sounds like it's home or balancing us until the very, very last chord when we hear the resolution after 7.5 minutes. And I was laughing at a quote that I was reading a few weeks ago where somebody had asked a student of Martinů if they considered Martinů to be a tonal composer, meaning writing in a key or following a key, or atonal, which means having no musical center and just choosing your pitches based on a different system. And the student said, no, I think that Martinů is a tonal composer, but he doesn't always get to giving you the key until the very end of the piece. And so I was laughing when I played it because it's kind of a joke to think, oh yes, the key piece is in F major, but we don't actually hear that sonority until the very end. So thank you for listening. I hope that you were able to hear me correctly. And now I will take a look at the chat, and I would love to hear comments, questions, discussions. I would also be curious to hear what pieces of Martinů you do know or have heard before, because there's so many of them.
I don't see any questions right now, so we have to encourage people to write some questions, because we were listening and it was just great. And I will start just with the general question. How was your way to understand Martinů, and how you discovered Martinů, and how it evolves, because I think it was probably not easy journey.
No, definitely not an easy journey. So actually the first piece that I did play of Martinů was from this set of puppets. So it wasn't this piece. He collected them into 3 different volumes. And I guess about, it must have been 2011. So 10 years ago, I was deciding to do a lecture recital about Janáček and his student Pavel Haas, who unfortunately died in Auschwitz during the war. So then I was looking, what are some composers of the time that knew each other? And Martinů knew Pavel Haas before he emigrated, and they stayed in touch before he lost track of them. And it was during the time when he first came to New York that he and a friend of his, Franciszek Rybka, were desperately trying to get a visa for Pavel Haas to get him out of the country, and unfortunately they didn't. So it's a sad story, but I discovered Martinů actually through Pavel Haas. And I did these puppets because they were, to be honest, they were the right length of pieces. So they weren't too long, because I needed 7 minutes piece. But then I was inspired by them and I wanted to know more, because when I looked at him, I listened and I said, nothing sounds like these pieces that I just played. So it was a question in my mind to understand why each one of his pieces has a little bit different flavor and what is the best way to approach them. And honestly, this sonata, I've done, all of the movements, and each one is quite different, but also very beautiful. But my first times reading it, it was one of those questions of, is this a good piece or not? Because I didn't immediately understand what was supposed to be happening or what Martinú's conception was in the piece. And so, learning the notes you do in the first week or so, and then that's behind you. But it took, maybe a month or so of really living with the piece before I felt I was understanding what he perhaps was wanting, which is the best that we can do when we interpret someone who's not living that we can speak to.
And also speaking, you mentioned his nomadic life. And, if it will be in the peaceful era, it will be so exciting, to study how he was influenced in Paris and how he was influenced. But also he was living probably under tremendous stress during very large parts of his life. So can you feel that in what he composed?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because most of the stress that we're used to thinking about when we look at composers of the past is more financial stress. So we think of Mozart dying in poverty and illness, etc. But Martinů, for the most part, was really well supported. When he was, the Czech government was still giving him a stipend when he first came to New York, and then when he became American citizen and retired, he was fairly well supported financially. So it was more the psychological pressure of having the many years of not hearing from his family. He had 3 years where no mail was coming between the US and what was happening in Czechoslovakia. And then having the rest of his family die without getting to see them, I think was the hardest thing. So the Paris years were the exploratory years. And then he was thinking, how can I get back to Paris or Prague? And then he never did. And that has to be the hardest part. And you can hear the music becoming more strident and more emotive on a deeper level the longer that he's forced to stay away from his homeland, and for some time just imagine the atrocities and then later to see the proofs of it was incredible.
We have a question for another pianist who is deeply involved and interested about Czech music, Isabel Kalety. Thank you for joining us. Bravo, Katelyn. Katelyn, I enjoyed your performance very much. What influence do you think resulted in Martinů's unique harmonic language?
That's
what has been your favorite piece to Martinů to play?
Both very good questions and difficult to answer. I think his unique harmonic language is definitely tied into his self-taught sort of atmosphere, because he never sat down and had a proper instruction. If you think of how tones are supposed to go and how keys are supposed to work and how form works. So really he taught himself by listening to what he liked and then putting it out into his own unique sort of style. So that can be the reason why he didn't follow any specific trend. And it also explains why he fell out of favor so quickly in the US, because a new trend was starting, which was serialism in the early 1950s. It's one reason why his time at Princeton ended, because Princeton is very famous with Milton Babbitt and Elliott Carter as being like the high point of serialism. And Martinů, that didn't fit in with his personality at all. So it's a combination of being self-taught and looking for what's around him in a non-codified way. So instead of learning from a textbook or learning from another composer to follow a form, he's like, oh, I like that, and this is my conception of it. And that's why it is so unique, in my opinion. Though I would be curious if there's any other theorist or someone who has a different explanation. It can be heard different way. There was an interesting analysis where they're trying to find this Moravian cadence that Janacek used, and you can find it in all but one pitch or something like this. So you can almost find it, but you can't quite find it. And maybe this is why Martinů was saying that he hated the musical scientists who overanalyzed and dissected, because maybe he didn't really know exactly why he was writing what he wrote. He wrote in a journal entry when he was a young student, I think 19 or 20, where he just sat down and he was thinking, and then he picked up a pencil and just wrote out a complete piece. And he's like, I didn't know what was happening. It was just sort of channeling through me. So that can be why it was difficult for him to be a teacher, because I don't think he always knew why he chose the tones and the pitches that he did, but it was sort of his absorption and then recreation. And my favorite piece, it's hard because my favorite piece is always the one I'm currently playing. I think the Viola Sonata is a very amazing piece, and it has an amazing piano part. So that might be one of my favorite to play, just because the energy works so well. I also think the first movement of this sonata has it's a much different structure. It's an easier structure to follow because he was modulating towards sort of first movement sonata form. And that might be currently one that I would enjoy playing. But I had a lot of fun with this second movement because it has so much drama, and there's parts of just this orchestral nature of the tremolos for so long that if you're playing on a good piano, it's very exciting, even for the performer, because you have the waves of sound coming at you. So I'm sorry that I can tell you 3 favorite ones to play, but ask me next year when I'm playing something else of his and I'll give you a different answer, probably.
As you know, we are celebrating the year of Martinů in the United States, and we already asked some Czech musicians from Czech Philharmonic Orchestra or Jana Czech Philharmonic and others to play some Martinů music, and also American musicians, including Isabel Keleti and Molly Morkovsky and David Ceruti and Luenting and Gergana and others. So more and more, are writing and are interested to be included to this program. So it's 1-year program. We definitely want to go also out, not to be only online. So you are invited to come around June 10th. We will open an exhibition, the real exhibition at the Bohemian National Hall, with support of Martinů Institute in Prague. And then during the summer, we hope that we will finally have some live concert on the roof or something like that. And during the fall, we are planning with students of Manes concert on Martinů. And in the end of the year, hopefully the Czech opera singer, excellent one, Esther Pavlou, is coming, and we hope we will have Martinů concert in the ballroom of the Bohemian National Hall. So it's our plan, but always, I watch, there is a new play in divadlo, Horácké divadlo, Vysočina, about Martinů's life. It goes from his birth and influence of his mother, and also, the conflict with the teacher in conservatory, and then going and how he met Zrzaví and Mucha and the Parisians. So I was always wondering, you already mentioned that he was trying to looking for some extrovert who will also influence him, and he was influencing Vítězslava Kaprálová. So how they musically influenced each other?
That's a really interesting, and I'm hoping that, unfortunately, there's still not a lot written about her life. Most of the information is read about Jiří Mucha or about Martinů, sort of peripheral speaking, or Rudolf Firkushny wrote about her as well during his time, and there's still a lot of work to be done on her side of the story. But I do know that they co-wrote several pieces together, mainly his concerti that he was writing in 1938 and 1939, and then she conducted those because he would refuse to get on stage. So she would rehearse the orchestra and conduct them, and he would be listening someplace, in the audience, and then afterwards she would say, oh, I think from the orchestral point of view, this is what you can do, because Martinů had no practical experience as a conductor. So although he was writing so much orchestral music, the symphonies, concerti, and opera, he wrote 16 operas. So he was writing so much for the stage, but he didn't understand as a practicing musician what that really meant. So she really trained and taught him how you need to present the music for the larger body. And they traveled together to London, and she conducted his pieces in London for the festival. So she had the outgoing effect on him that was really important. The flip side, when she died so tragically, and also sort of cut off their relationship because it was becoming, he wrote 37 letters to her in the space of 2 months when she was still back in Brno, and it was too much for her. She kind of had to stop the relationship because of the obsession, which was too bad, because I think if they could have continued and if she could have survived, it could have been an amazing partnership and collaboration for both of them. He was trying to secure for her a spot at Juilliard to continue studying, and it was unfortunate that her illness and then the war kind of broke them apart. But it's a fascinating topic.
I have one more topic. I think Michael Beckerman mentions that for these composers escaping Europe during that time during the war, it was not easy because the American classical music became very self-confident and people want to listen American composers. So if you can, you already mentioned Bela Bartok, but who was basically here in New York or on the East Coast during that time? What was the society that we can imagine, how we were surrounded by what composers?
Oh, so many. And you mentioned the West Coast. So a lot of them also traveled to LA. Famously, Schoenberg traveled to LA because he was wanting to be a film composer, because that he didn't have any financial sponsorship that Martinů had. So he really needed to find a lucrative position easily. So he thought, oh, why not be a film composer? Which, for anyone knows his style of music and the style of films that was happening in the 1950s and I guess 1944 is when he came. They're directly opposed to each other, so it makes sense that he gave some scores and was never accepted. But then he did find a post teaching at UCLA, so he was able to be quite an important teacher. So that was sort of the school on the West Coast, and everyone sort of followed under him. But there were Koussevitzky famously was in Boston as a composer, a conductor, and this is the reason why Martinů wrote his 6 symphonies when he came to New York, because Koussevitzky said, "I will play them, but I need some symphonies for you." Martinů had none, so he sat down and wrote them and gave them to Koussevitzky, he was a Russian Jew emigre, so that was another sort of flip. And then we have many amazing performers also. So Korngold, Zemlinsky, Pshenik, they were all coming, playing the violin in New York and in LA. Oh, and then famously too, because this is another sort of argument between Martinů, was Paul Hindemith, who had left Berlin and settled in Yale, who was maybe the most influential composition teacher of the 1950s before he fell out of favor. So many people, and they sort of had a brief reign and then fell off.
And does Martinů met with, for instance, Jaroslav Ježek, who was here at the same time, but was the jazz or in different field? Or
I know that they met because I've seen a picture of them together, but I don't remember reading any reaction between either of them. But that would be very interesting what Ježek would have thought to Martinú's feeling of jazz. Though by the time Martinů had come to the US, he was really done with the jazz style of writing. That was the earlier Paris years.
Yeah, but there was definitely friendship with for instance, Rudolf Firkušný and others who helped him, support him, and it was not easy because he was not speaking English, I think, when he came.
No, it took him quite a while, and his wife Charlotte almost never learned how to speak English, which was a very difficult thing. But it was Firkušný who brought Martinů out of Paris and found passage to him. So because Firkušný wrote that Martinů was sitting on the couch being like, I don't know what to do. So he literally grabbed him and put him on a train and left Paris. So without Rudolf, who knows what would have happened to Martinů? He could have been, who knows?
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I see we don't have any more questions here in the chat. So it's time for your final thoughts.
We're having such a good conversation. No need to ask questions. You're probably asking the ones that people are thinking. I'm curious, just, from, knowing Martinů for longer now, so I don't have the immediate feedback of hearing it for the first time. I'm curious if anyone just wants to put in the chat or turn on your camera and speak about what you felt about the music. Did you like it? Was it understandable? Did you not like it? It's just, this is my own field research, I guess, to see what your first reaction. Had anyone known these pieces before? I'm sure, Isabel, you knew them, obviously, if you're a pianist.
I don't know if she is still there.
Maybe she left.
And yeah, there is the question in the chat. I did know then, and I found them more pleasant to listen to that I imagined I would. So it's
so that's positive feedback. Though, Barbara, I'm not sure if you didn't hear the first Martinů, because I think I might have played that on one of our summer excursions in Dobrushka. Not sure. I can't remember. That was a couple years ago. Yeah, and the tango is great. So the title of the whole suite is called Film in Miniature, and it's a whole set of French dances, French songs. There's a berceuse, a chanson, and they're all, you know, in this sort of same miniature range, and they're all great. I've played all of them, and they're a really nice addition to a recital program because they're light but have a lot of just sort of musical depth. So if you don't know those as a pianist, those are really great pieces. Mirek, you just have to do a longer Zoom so you can just play everything, because I was trying to constrict it to not so much music.
No, you know,
it's
it's great that you can talk and play. And I'm sorry that in the Czech Republic is right now like 2 o'clock in the morning, because definitely people will watch our on Zoom. But you know, we are really privileged that in such prestigious schools are such excellent musicians and teachers and music researchers who devote their time to study the Czech music, not only from the 19th century, but even the older ones. You know, if I watch like the classic channels here on TV or radio, you are amazed how many of Czech composers are there almost permanently. If you listen just one evening, you will have hard time to count it on both of your hands. So, but I think it's important not only to play the music from Central Europe, but also to have the right context and to speak about it. And you know, so tell me, in Curtis, is there interest about classical Czech music, and do you have some courses on Czech music?
Yes, so I do an elective every year on some aspect of Czech music. So last semester it was an overview. It was of course we were completely online, so it was less specific than some of the other ones had been. And it was a performance class, so everyone was performing, and we did do the Martinů Viola Sonata, and it was very interesting because the student herself was wanting to follow or try to see how the immigrant process worked in classical music of the previous generations, because she herself was a first generation American from South Korea. So she was and a violist herself, so it was fascinating by how people were displaced in different times of the year. The previous year, we were focusing on that was the year that I released the CD of Miloslav Istvan's work. So we were focusing in the 1950s and the 1960s on censorship in music and samizdat manuscripts. So I made them all play from manuscripts that I had found in libraries at Yamu and Hamu and other areas, and had brought back to the US. So that was really fun for them. And some of it was the first time it had been performed that we could find a record of, and surely the first time in the United States. So it was very exciting for them to have the opportunity to give voice to something that they knew nothing of ahead of time. So next year, still to be determined.
And I know that you are teaching students all over the world. So, you know, it's so is there also interest if you are teaching somebody from Asia or Australia or over there?
That's the amazing thing about classical music, is it is so universal. So I have found no specific interest or bias contained to one sort of culture. It's more finding personality wise what speaks to you the most. And in every culture, if you go through different time periods and different composers, there's always something that you can identify with or resonate with more naturally than others. So perhaps I would say maybe a lot of the Asian students find it very interesting because the rhythms are so incisive and distinctive. And that's something in most Asian languages, they're more focused on tone and pitch than they are in rhythm. So they're very interested. I had a soprano who was singing some Haas and some Janacek, and she was loving the language and getting the sound. It was so much fun for her to try because it was something she had never forced herself to do before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, speaking about singing, we are excited when Esther Pavlou will come in December, and maybe her teacher, Professor Chmelo, also Vladimír Chmelo, who it was not so many years ago singing in Metropolitan Opera. So we hope that we had much more ahead. So thank you very much for this really great masterclass. I like to do that also because there is the strong tradition in the Czech Republic, and I hope it still continues, educating young people, kids of all ages and students during their studies. And so I'm glad that we can do it like this way online, and that you are so well technically also equipped that we can do it in such a great quality. So good evening to Philadelphia, and thank you very much, and see you soon in New York for an opening exhibition in June about Martinú's life.
Thank you. That would be amazing.